What happens when the person everyone owes money to decides that debt can be paid in blood? Welcome to this journey into one of the most chilling cases of systematic murder, disguised as rural justice in American history. But before we descend into these fog-shrouded valleys where the law ended and something far older began, I need you to ask yourself, is there any amount of money worth a human life? Where is the line between collecting what's owed and extracting what can never be repaid? Tell us where you're watching from right now and whether you believe debts can justify violence, because by the end of this account, you may question everything you thought you knew about obligation, desperation, and the darkness that flourishes when communities are left to police themselves. This episode contains detailed descriptions of violence, death, and historical suffering. The details included serve understanding, not sensationalism, but they are disturbing. This content discusses real historical events involving loss of life. We present these accounts with profound respect for those who suffered, died, and were left behind. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. In the archives of Breathitt County, Kentucky, there exists a ledger that shouldn't exist, a meticulously kept account book from 1936 to 1942, with entries that read like a merchant's records on one page and a death list on the next, names, amounts owed, dates of collection, and besides 17 specific entries, a single word written in red ink, settled. We're about to delve into a mystery that terrorized eastern Kentucky for 6 years, where one man transformed the simple act of debt collection into a reign of terror so systematic, so coldly calculated, that it took 17 lives before anyone understood what they were truly witnessing. This isn't just a story about murder. This is a question about how desperation can warp the social contract until death becomes an acceptable form of payment. It was the year 1936. The Great Depression had been crushing America for 7 years. Unemployment still hovered near 20%, and in the remote mountain communities of eastern Kentucky, cash had become more precious than gold, more rare than mercy. But in the isolated valleys of Breathitt County, one man had what everyone needed: money to borrow when crops failed, when children got sick, when winter came early and stayed late. His name was Cyrus Holt Morton, and he was about to prove that sometimes the most dangerous people aren't the ones who take what isn't theirs, but the ones who come to collect what is. There are places in America that exist outside of time, pockets of geography so remote that the modern world simply flows around them like water around stone, leaving them untouched, unchanged, and increasingly desperate. Breathitt County, Kentucky, in the 1930s was one such place, a landscape of impossible beauty hiding impossible poverty, where limestone cliffs rose 300 feet above rivers that ran copper brown with mine runoff, where morning fog rolled through valleys so thick you could taste the moisture on your tongue, metallic and cold, and where communities perched on hillsides clung to existence by sheer stubbornness and the fragile threads of mutual aid that kept families from starvation. The mountains here weren't the gentle, rolling kind that poets romanticize. These were ancient Appalachian peaks, worn down by millennia into something more menacing than majesty, dark, close, oppressive. They channeled sound in strange ways, so that a voice from a mile away could echo clear as a bell, while a scream from the next hollow would be swallowed entirely. The trees grew thick, oak, hickory, mountain laurel that bloomed white and poison, beautiful in spring, and beneath them the ground was a treacherous mixture of limestone rocks that could snap, ankle and red clay that became slick as oil when it rained, which it did often, the precipitation creating a perpetual dampness that seeped into houses, into bones, into the very psychology of people who lived there. In 1936, Breathitt County had a population of approximately 14,000 souls, scattered across 400 square miles of territory that had earned the nickname Bloody Breathitt in decades past due to family feuds that had killed over 200 people in the late 1800s. That violence had supposedly ended, replaced by a fragile peace mediated by county officials, sheriffs, and the intervention of state government. But the feuding hadn't truly stopped. It had just changed form, transformed from open warfare between clans into something more insidious, the quiet violence of economic desperation, where people killed each other slowly through impossible debts, through mortgages for closed on bad harvests, through the grinding poverty that made every winter a potential death sentence. Into this world of barely controlled chaos came Cyrus Holt Morton in 1933, though no one knew exactly where he came from. He appeared one autumn with a leather satchel full of cash, a silver pocket watch that caught the light like a promise, and an offer that seemed too good to be true. Loans at reasonable interest, no collateral required, just your word and your signature in his ledger. He was 42 years old, of average height but exceptional presence, the kind of man who entered a room and immediately became its center not through loudness, but through a quality of focused attention that made you feel simultaneously seen and evaluated. His eyes were pale gray, the color of winter sky, and they had a peculiar quality of never quite settling, always moving, always calculating, always keeping precise account of everything and everyone around him. He dressed well, but not ostentatiously. Dark wool suits that never seemed to collect the mountain dirt, white shirts that stayed crisp even in humidity, and those black leather gloves he always wore, even in summer, which people commented on but never quite dared to question directly. His voice was soft, almost gentle, with the barest trace of an accent no one could quite place, not quite southern, not quite northern, something in between that suggested he'd spent time many places and belonged nowhere. Morton rented a two-story house on the outskirts of Jackson, the county seat, a place that had seen better days, with peeling paint and a porch that sagged on one side, but which he never bothered to repair despite having obvious means. He kept the shutters closed during the day, worked by lamplight visible through cracks in the evening, and met with borrowers by appointment in what had once been the dining room. The room had a single table, 2 chairs, and the ledger. That infamous ledger bound in black leather with pages so fine they whispered when turned, where he recorded every transaction in handwriting so precise it looked like printing, every name and amount and term spelled out with absolute clarity. And people came to him, God, how they came. When your child has pneumonia and the doctor wants $5 you don't have, you come. When winter's arriving and you've got no coal for heat and no money for food until spring, you come. When your roof's caved in and you need lumber and nails and labor, you come. When the bank's foreclosing and you need one more season to save everything your family's worked for across 3 generations, you come. Morton never turned anyone away, never. That was the terrible beauty of his system. He would loan money to anyone on terms that seemed almost generous compared to the banks that had collapsed and the loan companies that charged rates so high they should have been criminal. 10% interest, payable within 1 year, extensions available if needed. No judgment, no shame, just business. Just your signature and your word. In that first year, 1933 to 1934, Morton loaned out approximately $15,000, a staggering sum in a county where the average yearly income was less than $300. By the end of 1935, he'd loaned to over 200 families. Everyone knew someone who'd borrowed from Cyrus Morton. Many people owed him themselves, and for a while it seemed like providence, like divine mercy. People whispered that he must be wealthy beyond measure, or perhaps a philanthropist testing some social theory, or maybe just a good man trying to help. They paid him back when they could, in installments, in goods, in labor on his property. He accepted it all with that quiet, calculating smile, making precise notes in his ledger, never pressing too hard, always patient, always understanding when someone needed more time. But there were rules, unspoken at first, then gradually clarified through a series of unfortunate examples. Morton expected his borrowers to keep their word. If you promised to pay by a certain date and didn't, if you avoided him when he came to call, if you spoke ill of him to others, or tried to leave the county without settling your account, well, Morton took that personally. Debt, he explained in his soft voice, was a sacred bond, a contract not just of money but of honor. Breaking that contract wasn't just an economic failing, it was a moral one. The first person who discovered what that meant was a man named Thomas Kemp, 30, 4 years old, father of 5, who'd borrowed $70 in March of 1936 to buy seed for his tobacco crop. The crop failed. A late frost killed the seedlings, a disaster Thomas couldn't have predicted or prevented. When September came and he couldn't pay, Thomas did what many people did. He avoided Morton, didn't answer when Morton came calling, hid in his fields when he saw that dark, suited figure walking up the dirt path to his cabin. According to Thomas's wife, Sarah, who survived him, Morton appeared at their door on the evening of September 28, 1936, just as the sun was setting behind the mountains, casting everything in that particular golden light that makes the world look beautiful and fragile. She answered the knock to find Morton standing there with his ledger under one arm, his face expressing neither anger nor threat, just a kind of patient expectation. "I've come for Thomas," Morton said quietly. "We have business to discuss." Sarah, frightened but not yet terrified this was still a debt collector, not a killer, told him Thomas wasn't home, which was a lie they both knew was a lie. Morton nodded slowly, as if this was exactly what he'd expected, and produced from his jacket pocket a folded piece of paper. He handed it to Sarah with those gloved hands, told her to give it to her husband, and walked away into the gathering dusk without another word. The paper was a notice, written in Morton's precise script. Final accounting due October 1st. Failure to appear will result in alternative collection. Thomas Kemp didn't appear on October 1st. He hid instead, convinced that Morton's alternative collection meant a lawsuit, maybe foreclosure on his property, legal troubles he thought he could evade by simply staying invisible. He was wrong. He had 3 days left to live, though he didn't know it. On the morning of October 4th, 1936, Thomas Kemp was found dead in his tobacco field by his eldest son, 11-year-old James. The boy had gone out at dawn to check the rabbit snares and discovered his father lying face down between the rows of withered plants that represented the failed crop, the debt that couldn't be paid. Sheriff William Haskins arrived within an hour of notification, along with the county doctor, Marcus Whitfield, who served as de facto medical examiner for unnatural deaths. What they found troubled them both in ways they couldn't initially articulate. Thomas Kemp's body showed no obvious signs of violence. No gunshot wounds, no stab marks, no blunt force trauma to the skull. His clothing was intact, undisturbed. His face, when they turned him over carefully, already knowing death had been hours ago from the rigidity and the coldness of his skin despite the mild October morning, showed an expression that Dr. Whitfield later described in his notes as extreme terror, jaw locked open, eyes wide. The kind of expression that suggested Thomas Kemp had died afraid, had died looking at something that filled him with absolute horror. But the cause of death wasn't immediately apparent. Dr. Whitfield performed an examination there in the field, unwilling to move the body until he'd documented everything he could observe. He noted abrasions on Thomas's wrists and ankles, as if he'd been bound. Though no rope marks remained, just raw skin that suggested restraints. He noted fingernail marks on Thomas's own forearms and chest, suggesting the man had clawed at himself in panic or pain. And he noted something else, something that would become significant later. Thomas's hands were covered in dirt under the fingernails, fresh earth driven deep, as if he'd been digging or clawing at the ground. The sheriff searched the surrounding area while the doctor worked. The tobacco field showed no signs of struggle, no disturbed earth beyond the normal working of the farm. But at the edge of the field, where it met the tree line, Haskins found something that made his blood run cold. Footprints. 2 sets. One matching Thomas Kemp's boots, the other belonging to someone wearing dress shoes with a distinctive heel pattern. The prints led into the woods, disappeared where leaves covered the ground, then reappeared near a small clearing about 200 yards from where the body was found. In that clearing, the sheriff discovered evidence of what could only be called a ritual. A circle had been drawn in the dirt, approximately 6 feet in diameter, marked with rocks at 4 cardinal points. Inside the circle, the ground had been disturbed, as if something had been buried and then dug up. There were burned remnants of paper. The sheriff could make out fragments of writing, but nothing complete enough to read. And most disturbing, there was a stake driven into the center of the circle, with something dark staining its top. Later analysis would confirm it was blood, human blood, Thomas Kemp's blood. Dr. Whitfield's official cause of death, filed on October 5th after a more thorough examination of the body, read, "Cardiac arrest due to extreme shock or fear. Contributing factors, unknown. Toxin or psychological trauma of sufficient severity to stop the heart." In other words, Thomas Kemp had been literally frightened to death. The community reacted with confusion and grief, but not, initially, with understanding. People assumed Thomas had gotten involved in something dangerous, maybe moonshining, maybe a dispute with someone from a feuding family, maybe something in his past that had caught up with him. The funeral was well attended, the sympathy genuine, and life continued because in places like Breathitt County in 1936, death was common enough that it couldn't be allowed to stop the daily struggle for survival. But Sheriff Haskins couldn't let it go. He was 50, 6 years old, a county sheriff for 19 years, and he'd seen plenty of murders in his time. Breathitt County's reputation wasn't unearned. But he'd never seen anything like this. He questioned Sarah Kemp extensively, learned about the debt to Morton, about the notice Morton had delivered, about the alternative collection, phrase that had seemed so ominous in hindsight. On October 7th, the sheriff paid a visit to Cyrus Morton's rented house. Morton received him graciously, offered coffee which Haskins declined, and listened with apparent concern as the sheriff explained about Thomas Kemp's death and the strange circumstances surrounding it. A tragedy, Morton said softly, his pale eyes never leaving the sheriff's face. "Thomas Kemp owed me $70. I came to collect. The superposition disappears, but he chose to avoid me. I left him a final notice, that's all. I never saw him again. And the system settles into a single outcome." Haskins said carefully, mentioned alternative collection. "What did you mean by that?" Morton's expression didn't change. "Legal remedies, Sheriff, liens on property, garnishment of wages if he ever found employment, standard debt collection procedures. Surely you're not suggesting I had anything to do with his death." The sheriff had no evidence to suggest that Morton had, no witnesses placing Morton near the field, No physical evidence connecting Morton to the clearing with its disturbing ritual markers. The dress shoe prints in the woods were circumstantial at best. Half the men in Jackson wore similar shoes to church on Sundays. But Haskins left that meeting with a conviction in his gut that Cyrus Morton knew more than he was saying. There was something in the man's perfect composure, in the way those cold eyes assessed and calculated, in the slight smile that never quite reached his face. The sheriff began asking questions, discreetly, about Morton's other debtors, about anyone else who'd failed to pay on time. What he discovered was troubling. There were 4 other borrowers who'd defaulted on loans in the past 6 months. All had received similar final notices from Morton. All had subsequently come up with the money borrowed from family, sold possessions, did whatever it took to satisfy the debt. When Haskins interviewed them, they were reluctant to talk, but eventually a pattern emerged. Morton had visited each of them after the notice period expired. He'd had them accompany him somewhere private. He'd shown them something. None of them would say exactly what. And they'd all been absolutely terrified into paying. "People still report a sweetness in the air," said one man, his hands shaking as he spoke to the sheriff in confidence. He shows you what happens, what will happen. I can't explain it, but I found the money. I don't care what I had to do. I found it." But this is where the story takes its first dark turn, because Sheriff Haskins's investigation was about to be interrupted by a second death. And this time there would be a witness. Marjorie Watkins was 8 years old, a widow with 3 children under the age of 7. Her husband had died in a mine collapse in 1934, leaving her with a small farm that barely produced enough to feed her family. She'd borrowed $40 from Morton in the spring of 1936 to buy chickens and supplies. By October, she still owed $32, and Morton had sent her the notice. Marjorie was made of sterner stuff than Thomas Kemp. She confronted Morton directly, went to his house on October 15th, and told him plainly, "I don't have your money, Mr. Morton, and I won't have it until spring when I can sell my hogs. You can't. Take me to court if you want, but you can't get blood from a stone." Morton listened to her with that peculiar stillness he had, like a snake watching prey, and then he smiled. Not a cruel smile, almost gentle. "Mrs. Watkins," he said softly, "I understand your circumstances. I truly do. But you signed an agreement. You gave your word, and words have power. Debts have weight. They must be settled one way or another. Then you'll wait until spring," Marjorie said firmly, "or you'll get nothing at all." Morton opened his ledger, that black leather book that was always with him, and made a note beside her name. "I'll give you 1 week to reconsider," he said. "If you haven't paid by October 22nd, we'll settle the debt my way. I think you'll find my terms persuasive." Marjorie left, disturbed but defiant. She told her neighbor, Evelyn March, about the conversation, about the strange threat that didn't sound like a threat, but felt like one. Evelyn, who'd heard about Thomas Kemp's mysterious death and the rumors circulating about Morton's alternative collection methods, urged Marjorie to find the money somehow. "There's something wrong with that man," Evelyn said. "I don't know what, but there's something wrong." On the evening of October 21st, 1 day before Morton's deadline, Marjorie Watkins disappeared. Her eldest daughter, 7-year-old Rebecca, told the sheriff that a man had come to the house just after sunset. She'd seen him from the window, a man in a dark suit, wearing gloves. He'd knocked on the door. Marjorie had answered, spoken with him briefly, then put on her shawl and followed him into the darkening evening, telling the children she'd be back within the hour. She never came back. Sheriff Haskins organized a search party by morning. They found Marjorie's body 3 days later on October 24th, in a place that would haunt the county for generations. A narrow limestone cave about 4 miles from her farm, a cave that locals called the Devil's Throat because of the way wind howled through its entrance. She was dead. But the manner of her death was what broke hardened men into tears and made the sheriff vomit into the ferns outside the cave mouth before he could compose himself enough to do his duty. Marjorie Watkins had been buried alive, not immediately, according to Dr. Whitfield's examination. Not killed and then buried. She'd been placed in a wooden crate roughly made, barely large enough for her body, and that crate had been positioned in the cave and covered with rocks. Not deeply buried, not hidden, just entombed. There were scratches inside the crate lid, deep gouges where Marjorie had clawed at the wood with her fingernails until they bled, until some of them tore away completely. The boards showed dents and cracks where she'd tried to kick her way out. And in the dirt of the cave floor, beneath where the crate had rested, they found marks suggesting she'd been alive for some time after being sealed inside, long enough to exhaust herself completely in the effort to escape. Dr. Whitfield estimated she'd survived between 12 and 18 hours in that darkness, in that suffocating confinement, before shock, dehydration, and sheer terror stopped her heart. The cause of death was listed as cardiac arrest secondary to severe psychological trauma and physical confinement, which was a medical way of saying she died of horror. And beside her body, tucked into the crate with what seemed like mocking care, was a piece of paper. A receipt written in Morton's precise hand that read, "Debt settled, balance 0. Now the county understood. Now they saw the pattern, and now they were terrified. Sheriff Haskins arrested Cyrus Morton on October 25, 1936, on suspicion of murder. Morton came willingly, almost peacefully, bringing his ledger with him as if he'd been expecting the invitation. He was held in the county jail while the sheriff and the prosecutor tried to build a case. But they faced an almost impossible challenge. There was no physical evidence tying Morton to either death. No witnesses had seen him kill anyone. No murder weapons could be found. The only connections were circumstantial. The debts, the notices, the threats that didn't quite threaten, and the timing. Morton's defense attorney, a slick lawyer from Lexington who appeared seemingly out of nowhere to represent him, argued that his client was being persecuted for the crime of being an effective debt collector. My client has committed no crime except expecting people to honor their word. The lawyer said, if you punish him for that, you punish the very foundation of commerce and trust that holds society together. The preliminary hearing was held on November 3, 1936. Morton sat quietly throughout, his pale eyes watching everyone, his gloved hands folded on the table before him. The prosecutor presented the circumstantial case. The defense tore it apart methodically. Judge Harrison Clemens, a 68-year-old veteran of 3 decades on the bench, listened to both sides and then rendered his decision. Insufficient evidence to hold the defendant for trial. Cyrus Morton walked out of the courthouse, a free man on November 4, 1936. According to multiple witnesses, he paused on the courthouse steps, looked out at the crowd of townspeople who'd gathered, some to support him, most to glare at him in impotent fury, and smiled that cold, calculating smile. Debts must be paid. He said quietly, one way or another, they must always be paid. Then he walked back to his rented house, closed the shutters, and resumed his business of lending money to desperate people at reasonable rates. And Sheriff Haskins, standing on those same courthouse steps, felt something he'd never experienced before in his 19 years of law enforcement. Absolute certainty that a guilty man had escaped. Justice combined with absolute helplessness to do anything about it. What happened next would prove him right. and would demonstrate that some monsters don't need to hide in shadows, they can operate in plain sight, protected by the very system meant to stop them. The weeks following Morton's release were characterized by a peculiar silence in Breathitt County, the kind of quiet that settles over prey animals when a predator is near. People stopped talking openly about debts. Conversations about money happened in whispers behind closed doors. And those who owed Morton, and there were still dozens of families in that position, became meticulous about making payments on time, no matter what sacrifices were required. But some people couldn't pay. The Depression didn't care about fear. Crops still failed. Livestock still died. Children still got sick and needed doctors. And the debts still came due. On November 28, 1936, Thanksgiving weekend, when families were supposed to gather in gratitude, a man named Robert Jessup failed to make his payment on a $100 loan. Robert was 46 years old, a former coal miner disabled by lung disease, father of 7 children ranging in age from 3 to 16. He'd borrowed the money in desperation when his wife developed appendicitis and needed emergency surgery. He'd been paying in tiny increments, $5 here, $3 there, whatever he could scrape together. But by November, he was still $60 in arrears, and his payment schedule had become erratic. Morton sent him the notice. Robert, unlike Thomas Kemp and Marjorie Watkins, went to see the sheriff immediately. He appeared in Haskins's office on December 1st, shaking, pale, holding the folded paper like it was a death warrant. "He's going to kill me," Robert said simply, "just like he killed the others, and there's nothing you can do about it, is there?" Sheriff Haskins wanted to say Robert was wrong. He wanted to offer protection, to promise safety. But the truth was stark. He had no legal grounds to arrest Morton again, no way to prevent him from collecting on debts that were legitimate and documented. The only thing Haskins could do was increase patrols, try to watch Morton's movements, and hope he could catch the man in the act of whatever he was doing. "Stay in public places," Haskins urged. "Don't meet with Morton alone. If he approaches you, run. Go to family, go to friends, don't be alone, and for God's sake, if you can borrow the money from anyone else, do it." Robert tried. His family scraped together $30 from various sources, money that left them with almost nothing for winter. But at least it was something. Robert took the payment to Morton's house on December 5th, knocked on the door, tried to explain that he'd have the rest by March, by spring at the latest. Morton accepted the payment with his usual courteous silence. He noted it carefully in his ledger, every penny accounted for. Then he looked up at Robert with those cold gray eyes and said, "That leaves $30 outstanding. The final payment is due December 20th. If you don't have it by then, we'll proceed with alternative collection. I trust you understand the terms." Robert understood. He spent the next 2 weeks in a state of escalating panic, barely sleeping, jumping at shadows, refusing to leave his house after dark. His wife, Eleanor, later testified that he'd started making arrangements, speaking with the pastor about the children's care, writing down instructions for the farm, talking as if he knew he was going to die and wanted to make sure his family would be all right afterward. On December 19th, the day before the final deadline, Robert did something that showed either remarkable courage or complete desperation. He went to Morton's house with a proposition. He didn't have the $30. He couldn't get the $30. But he would sign over ownership of his small farm, 10 acres of barely productive land with a decrepit farmhouse, but it was something, in exchange for forgiveness of the debt. Morton considered this offer for a long moment, then shook his head slowly. "I don't want your land, Mr. Jessup. I want what you owe me, in one form or another. Then what? Robert asked, his voice breaking. What do you want from me? Morton's expression remained neutral, almost gentle. I want you to understand that debts are sacred, that your word is binding, that there are consequences for broken promises. Come to me tomorrow at sunset, at the place I'll describe to you, and I'll show you exactly what I mean. Bring your family if you'd like witnesses to the settlement. Robert left that meeting and went directly to the sheriff. He recounted the entire conversation, including Morton's strange invitation. Haskins saw an opportunity. If he could catch Morton in the act of whatever ritual or psychological torture he was using, he might finally have the evidence needed for arrest. The sheriff organized a plan. Robert would go to the meeting as instructed. Haskins and 2 deputies would follow at a distance, hidden, ready to intervene the moment anything criminal occurred. It was risky, using Robert as bait, but Robert insisted anything was better than waiting in terror for death to find him. December 20th, 1936. Sunset came early in the winter mountains, around 5:30 in the afternoon. Robert Jessup walked along the path Morton had described, a trail leading into the woods near the old cemetery on the outskirts of Jackson. Sheriff Haskins and his deputies, armed and alert, followed 50 yards behind, moving as quietly as men could move through winter, bare forest where every step seemed to crack a twig, rustle a leaf, announce their presence. They watched Robert reach a small clearing, the same clearing Haskins realized with a chill, where they'd found evidence after Thomas Kemp's death. The circle was still there, faintly visible in the dirt. The stake remained, dark with old stains. And Morton was waiting, standing beside a lantern that cast dancing shadows across his dark suit, his gloved hands, his pale eyes that seemed to catch and hold the light like mirrors. "You came," Morton said softly. "Good. That shows respect. That shows understanding. I don't have your money," Robert said, his voice steady despite the fear visible in every line of his body. "But I'm here. Tell me what you want." Morton reached into his jacket and pulled out his ledger. He opened it, ran one gloved finger down a page, stopped at Robert's name. $60 initially borrowed, $30 repaid, $30 outstanding, plus interest $3, total balance $33. He looked up. "That's what's owed, but the question is, how will you pay?" "I can't pay in money," Robert said. "I've got nothing left to give you." "Oh, but you do," Morton replied, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "You have time, you have fear, you have the rest of your life, however short or long that might be. Those have value too." In the bushes 50 yards away, Sheriff Haskins tensed, ready to move, waiting for something, anything, overtly criminal. But Morton hadn't touched Robert, hadn't threatened him explicitly. He was just talking, just standing there with his ledger and his lantern. And then Morton did something that made the sheriff's blood freeze. He began to speak in a language that wasn't English. The words were strange, rhythmic, almost musical in their cadence. They seemed to echo in the clearing despite the open air, seemed to press down on everything like a physical weight. Robert Jessup staggered, clutched at his chest, his face going white. Sheriff Haskins burst from cover, pistol drawn, shouting for Morton to stop, to get away from Robert. The deputies followed, crashing through the underbrush, converging on the clearing from 3 sides. Morton stopped speaking, looked at the sheriff calmly, without surprise, as if he'd known they were there all along. "Good evening, Sheriff," he said. "Come to witness the settlement." Robert Jessup collapsed to his knees, gasping, clutching his chest. Haskins ran to him, checked for wounds, for any sign of physical attack. There was nothing. Robert was having some kind of attack. His heart racing, his breath coming in desperate pants, his eyes wide with terror. But there was no visible cause. "What did you do to him?" Haskins demanded, turning his pistol on Morton. Morton closed his ledger carefully. "I collected what was owed, Sheriff, as is my right. Mr. Jessup here has now paid his debt in full. Haven't you, Robert?" And Robert, struggling to breathe, clearly in medical distress, nodded weakly. "Yes," he gasped. "Paid. It's paid. You see," Morton said to the sheriff, "a willing transaction between debtor and creditor. No crime has been committed. The debt is settled. We're finished here." He picked up his lantern, walked past the sheriff and the deputies, and disappeared into the darkening woods, leaving them with Robert Jessup, who was now experiencing what Dr. Whitfield would later diagnose as a severe panic attack complicated by stress, induced cardiac symptoms, but Robert survived. Unlike Thomas Kemp and Marjorie Watkins, Robert Jessup lived through his encounter with Morton's alternative collection. He spent 3 days in the county hospital, recovering from what doctors called nervous exhaustion. And when he was released, he left Breathitt County immediately with his entire family, abandoning their farm, their home, everything they owned, rather than remain in the same county as Cyrus Morton. Before he left, Robert gave a statement to the sheriff, and this is what he said. "He didn't touch me, Sheriff. He didn't have to. When he started speaking those words, whatever language that was, it was like the ground opened up beneath me and I could see forever, down into darkness that went on. And I knew with absolute certainty that if I didn't agree that the debt was paid, if I fought him even for a second, I would fall into that darkness and never stop falling. It was real, Sheriff, as real as you standing here. He didn't kill those people with weapons. He killed them with truth, with showing them something true about death and fear and what's waiting for all of us. And once you see it, once you know it's real, you can't unknow it. Your heart just gives up." Sheriff Haskins filed a report detailing the incident. He tried to press charges for assault, for threatening behavior, for something. The prosecutor reviewed the case and declined to proceed. There was no physical evidence of assault, no witnesses to actual violence. Robert's testimony about seeing darkness wouldn't hold up in court. It sounded like hallucination, like mental illness, not crime. Cyrus Morton remained free, and his business continued. By the end of 1936, Morton's ledger contained 247 active loans totaling over $20,000. Most borrowers paid on time, often at tremendous personal cost, selling everything they owned, begging from relatives, doing anything to avoid being marked delinquent. But some couldn't pay, and those who couldn't face the notices, the invitations, the alternative collection. Between December 1936 and March 1937, 4 more people died under circumstances eerily similar to Thomas Kemp and Marjorie Watkins. All owed Morton money, all had received final notices, all died with expressions of absolute terror, their hearts stopped by what doctors could only describe as extreme psychological shock. The county was paralyzed by fear. People began leaving whole families packing up in the middle of the night, abandoning debts and homes, fleeing to other counties, other states, anywhere that wasn't within reach of Cyrus Morton and his ledger. The population of Jackson dropped by nearly 200 people in those 3 months. Houses stood empty. Businesses closed. The economy, already ravaged by the Depression, entered a death spiral, and yet, and this is the truly disturbing part, some people defended Morton. Not openly, not loudly, but in whispered conversations, in private justifications that revealed something dark about human nature. They argued that Morton was only collecting what was legitimately owed, that he'd loaned money when no one else would, that people who borrowed had agreed to terms and should honor them, that the deaths, while tragic, were somehow the debtor's own fault for not paying. This split the community. Families stopped speaking to each other over it. Churches found their congregations divided. The very fabric of society in Breathitt County began to tear apart, not from the deaths themselves, but from the question those deaths raised. Where was the line between legal debt collection and murder, and who got to decide? Sheriff Haskins became obsessed with stopping Morton. He knew with absolute certainty that the man was a killer. But how do you arrest someone for murders that leave no physical evidence? How do you prosecute when every interaction looks like a legal business transaction until the victim dies hours or days later, alone, of nothing more than terror? The sheriff began an investigation that went beyond the deaths. He looked into Morton's background, trying to find where the man had come from, who he really was. What he discovered only deepened the mystery. There was no record of Cyrus Holt Morton before 1933. No birth certificate in any state. No military records despite him being of age for the Great War. No previous addresses, no family, no history. It was as if he'd simply materialized fully formed with a satchel of money and a knowledge of how to weaponize fear. But Haskins did find something in old newspaper archives from other counties, other states. Similar cases going back decades. Different names, but always the same pattern. A well-dressed man who loans money at reasonable rates, who keeps meticulous records in a black leather ledger, who collects debts through alternative methods when borrowers default. In Tennessee in 1928, 7 people died mysteriously, all debtors to a man named Charles Morrison. In West Virginia in 1923, 9 deaths connected to a lender named Harold Colt. In Virginia in 1918, 13 deaths linked to a creditor named Simon Holt. Different names, but when Haskins obtained photographs from those old cases, grainy, faded images from newspapers and police files, he saw the same face, the same pale eyes, the same dark suits and leather gloves. Either Cyrus Morton had been operating under different names for at least 20 years, which would make him older than he appeared, or there was something else going on, something that didn't fit into rational explanation. The sheriff shared his findings with the prosecutor, with the judge, with anyone who would listen. They looked at him with pity and concern. Stress of the job, they said. Obsession with an unsolvable case. Maybe it was time to retire, to step away before the burden broke him. But Haskins couldn't step away. Because more people were dying, on April 1st, 1937, a date so ironic it seemed like cosmic mockery, something changed. A young woman named Catherine Price, 26 years old, mother of 2, received a final notice from Morton for a debt of $45. Unlike the other victims, Catherine didn't run, didn't hide, didn't panic. She did something no one else had thought to do. She went public. She stood up in church on Sunday, April 4th, and she told the entire congregation about her debt, about Morton's notice, about her certainty that he intended to kill her if she didn't pay. And then she said something that shocked everyone into silence. "I'm not going to pay. I can't pay, and I won't be terrorized into destroying my family trying. If he wants to kill me, he'll have to do it in front of all of you. I'm staying here, in public, surrounded by witnesses, every moment until his deadline passes, and we'll see if his magic works when the whole town is watching." It was a challenge, a defiance, and it was brilliant. The community rallied around Catherine in a way they hadn't for previous victims. Families took turns staying with her, ensuring she was never alone. The church became a makeshift sanctuary, with people rotating through in shifts, maintaining a constant presence. Sheriff Haskins assigned deputies to guard her house. Morton's deadline came and went, April 8th, sunset, and Catherine remained alive, surrounded by people, protected by witnesses. Morton appeared at the church on April 9th. He walked up to the door, knocked politely, and asked to speak with Catherine Price. The pastor refused. Morton didn't force his way in. He simply said, "The debt remains unpaid. It will be settled eventually. These things always are." Then he walked away. Catherine lived. Days passed. Weeks. The protection detail gradually relaxed as it became clear that Morton wasn't going to act. People began to believe that perhaps Catherine had found the solution, that Morton's power required isolation, secrecy, privacy, that witnesses and publicity could stop him. They were wrong. On May 17, 1937, Catherine's 6-year-old daughter, Emily, disappeared from the schoolyard during recess. One moment she was playing with other children, the next she was gone. A massive search was organized immediately. They found her 6 hours later, at sunset, in the woods near the old cemetery. She was alive, unharmed physically, but she was catatonic, unresponsive, her eyes wide and staring at nothing. When Dr. Whitfield examined her, he found no injuries, no evidence of assault. But Emily wouldn't speak, wouldn't eat, wouldn't acknowledge anyone's presence. She just stared and occasionally whimpered, a sound that broke her mother's heart and terrified everyone who heard it. Catherine found a note pinned to her daughter's dress. Written in Morton's distinctive hand, it said, "Children inherit their parents' debts. Payment in full is still required. You have until June 1st to settle the account, or I'll continue collection through the next heir." Catherine had 2 children. Emily was the oldest. The threat was explicit and horrifying. She paid the debt, sold everything she owned, borrowed from every relative and friend, reduced herself to absolute poverty. She brought Morton the $45 on May 20th, 3 days after Emily's abduction, and she swore at him, screamed at him, threatened him with God's judgment and eternal damnation. Morton accepted the payment with his usual calm courtesy. Debt settled. He said, "Your daughter will recover in time. Children are resilient. They forget." Emily did recover partially. She eventually began speaking again, eating again, behaving like a living child instead of an empty shell. But she was never the same. She developed a terror of darkness that lasted the rest of her life. She would wake screaming in the night. And when asked what happened during those 6 hours she was missing, she could only say, "He showed me where bad people go, where people who don't keep promises go, and Mama was there. Mama was there, burning forever." After that, resistance to Morton collapsed entirely. No one challenged him again. No one refused payment. People destroyed themselves financially to meet his terms, and if they couldn't, they fled the county before the deadline arrived. Breathitt County's population continued to plummet, but Sheriff Haskins had reached a breaking point. If the law couldn't stop Morton, if evidence and courts and civilization couldn't protect innocent people from this predator, then maybe justice required a different approach. Maybe Morton needed to be stopped by means that existed outside the legal system. The sheriff began making quiet inquiries among men he trusted. Veterans of feuding days, hard men who'd done hard things, and who understood that sometimes the world required violence to protect the innocent from evil. He didn't frame it as murder. He framed it as defense, as protection, as the removal of a threat that law and justice couldn't contain. On June 15, 1937, 8 men met in the back room of a feed store in Jackson. Sheriff Haskins laid out the situation plainly. Cyrus Morton was a killer. The courts couldn't touch him. More people would die unless someone acted. He didn't order anyone to do anything. He simply stated facts and let the men draw their own conclusions. 3 of those men, Jacob Thornton, Michael Reese, and Samuel Pritchard, volunteered to handle what they delicately called the Morton problem. They were all debtors themselves, all living in terror of default, all motivated by a combination of self-preservation and genuine desire to protect their community. Their plan was simple: ambush Morton on one of his evening walks, shoot him, dispose of the body where it would never be found, claim he'd left town. No body, no crime, no investigation that couldn't be quietly suppressed by a sheriff who had every reason to want Morton gone. On the evening of June 20th, 1937, the three men waited in the woods near Morton's house, armed with rifles, determined to end his reign of terror. Morton emerged at his usual time, walking with his customary unhurried pace, his ledger under one arm, his lantern in hand despite the June twilight providing adequate light. Jacob Thornton fired first, a clean shot, center mass, at 30 yards, a range at which Thornton had killed deer, had killed men during feuding days. The bullet should have dropped Morton instantly. It didn't. According to the testimony, all three men gave later testimony dismissed as stress, induced hallucination by authorities, but sworn to as truth until their dying days. The bullet never reached Morton. It simply stopped in midair about 5 feet from him, hung there visible for a moment like a bee suspended in amber, then dropped to the ground with a metallic clink. All three men fired, 9 shots total, same result for each one. The bullets stopped, hung in air, fell harmlessly. Morton didn't even flinch. He turned toward the woods where they hid, his pale eyes finding them unerringly in the gathering darkness, and he smiled. "Gentlemen," he called out softly, his voice carrying perfectly despite the distance. "Did you really think violence would work? Debts aren't settled with bullets. They're settled with payment, with acknowledgement, with acceptance." He began walking toward them, still smiling, utterly unconcerned with the rifles pointed at him. The three men ran. They weren't cowards, these were hard men who'd faced death before. But they ran because every instinct screamed that Morton was something other, something wrong, something that couldn't be fought with conventional means. They went to the sheriff's office, confessed everything, begged for protection. Haskins believed them. He'd seen enough strangeness around Morton to believe that the man was protected by something beyond normal understanding. He arranged for the three would be killers to leave the county immediately, helped them and their families relocate to Tennessee, hoped that distance would save them. It didn't. Jacob Thornton died 2 weeks later in his new home in Nashville, heart attack, age 34. No prior cardiac issues. He died clutching his chest, his face frozen in terror, his wife holding him as he gasped out his last words, "He's here, Morton's here. I didn't pay what I owed him." Michael Reese lasted 3 months. He died in September in Knoxville, same cause, same expression, same final words about debts unpaid. Samuel Pritchard survived until November before his heart gave out in Chattanooga. His last words a whispered apology to Morton for attempting violence against a creditor who'd done nothing but loan money in good faith. By the end of 1937, 17 people connected to Morton's lending business had died mysterious deaths. The county's population had dropped below 10,000. Businesses were failing. The courthouse was processing dozens of property abandonments every month. Breathitt County was dying, killed not by economic depression, but by collective terror. And Cyrus Morton continued his work, lending money at reasonable rates, keeping meticulous records, and collecting debts in the currency of fear when cash wasn't available. But every system has a breaking point. Every predator eventually pushes too far. For Morton, that moment came in February of 1938, when he made the mistake of targeting someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain from exposing him. Dr. Marcus Whitfield, the county's medical examiner and physician, had borrowed $200 from Morton in the spring of 1937 to keep his medical practice solvent when patients couldn't pay their bills. He'd managed to make partial payments through the year, but by February 1938, he still owed $140 with no prospect of raising that sum. Morton sent the notice. Whitfield received it with a strange calm. He was 50, 6 years old, a widower with no children, a man who'd spent 3 decades serving the community and watching people suffer and die from poverty and violence, and now this new horror that wore a human face and carried a ledger. Instead of fleeing or panicking, Dr. Whitfield did something extraordinary. He documented everything. Every interaction with Morton, every patient he'd examined who'd died under mysterious circumstances, every detail of the pattern he'd observed professionally, but been too afraid to speak about openly. He compiled medical records, testimonies, observations, and his own professional conclusions into a detailed report that ran to 73 pages. Then he sent copies to newspapers in Lexington, Louisville, and Cincinnati, to the Kentucky Attorney General's office, to medical journals, to anyone who might read it and understand that something impossible and terrible was happening in Breathitt County. The report was titled, Medical Analysis of 17 Deaths Attributed to Debt Collection, Evidence of Supernatural Homicide or Mass Psychological Manipulation in Breathitt County, Kentucky, 1936-1938. It was published in the Louisville Courier Journal on February 28, 1938, with the headline, Doctor Claims Debt Collector from Hell Killing Borrowers Through Fear. The story went national within days. Newspapers across the country picked it up, some treating it as sensationalism, others as evidence of rural superstition, a few taking it seriously as a case study in mass psychology and the power of fear to kill. Dr. Marcus Whitfield died on March 3, 1938, 3 days after publication. Heart failure, same circumstances as the others, but he'd known it was coming. He'd written a final note, found beside his body, that read, I have paid my debt with truth. If Morton kills me as he's killed the others, at least now there is a record. At least now people know. And they did know. The national attention brought investigators from the Kentucky State Police, from federal agencies, from journalists and researchers who descended on Breathitt County demanding answers. Morton's house was searched thoroughly. His financial records were seized. His ledger, that infamous black leather book, was confiscated as evidence. What they found was simultaneously damning and useless. The ledger was exactly what it appeared to be, a meticulous record of legitimate loans with dates, amounts, terms, and repayment schedules. Morton's finances showed no source of income beyond interest on the loans, which didn't explain where his original capital had come from. His personal effects were minimal clothes, basic furniture, the ledger, and one other item that investigators found hidden in a locked box in his bedroom, a collection of small leather pouches, each labeled with a name and containing what appeared to be hair, nail clippings, and other biological material. Each pouch corresponded to someone who'd borrowed money from Morton and subsequently died. The evidence suggested some kind of ritual magic or folk practice. But there was no law against keeping souvenirs, no matter how macabre. No physical evidence that Morton had used these materials to harm anyone. No proof of any crime that would stand up in court. The state prosecutor made the attempt anyway. Morton was arrested again on March 10, 1938, charged with 17 counts of murder. The trial began in May, lasted 6 weeks, and became a media sensation. Courtroom packed daily, reporters from everywhere, testimony from survivors, from families of the dead, from Sheriff Haskins, who laid out years of investigation and suspicion. Morton's defense was simple and devastating. He was a businessman who'd helped the community by providing loans when banks wouldn't. The deaths were tragic coincidences, or possibly the result of guilt and stress among people who'd borrowed money they couldn't repay. He'd never threatened anyone physically, never touched anyone violently. His alternative collection simply meant legal remedies, liens, and judgments that debtors had misunderstood and feared due to their own guilt. As for the biological materials found in his possession, a hobby, an eccentric interest in keepsakes from business associates. Weird, yes. Criminal, no. The jury deliberated for 11 days. The vote was 10-2 for conviction, but Kentucky law required unanimous verdicts in capital cases. The jury was hung. Judge Clemens declared a mistrial on June 24, 1938. The prosecutor announced his intention to retry the case. But before that could happen, something strange occurred. Morton posted bail, a staggering $5,000 that appeared from nowhere, paid in cash, and was released pending the new trial. He left his rented house on June 26, walked to the bank, withdrew all his remaining funds, and disappeared. Simply vanished, no forwarding address, no trail. Sheriff Haskins organized a manhunt that found nothing. It was as if Cyrus Holt Morton had never existed, except for the ledger, which was retained as evidence, and except for the bodies, 17 of them, buried in graves marked with dates and names that told the story of systematic terror. In the years following Morton's disappearance, there were occasional reports from other parts of the country. A debt collector in Ohio in 1940, 2 whose clients mysteriously died. A moneylender in Alabama in 1940, 7 associated with unexplained deaths. A financier in Oregon in 1950, 3 linked to similar patterns, different names, same methods. Same pale eyes in the few photographs that existed, but nothing was ever proven. The cases remained mysteries, unsolved, relegated to the category of strange historical anomalies that don't fit comfortable narratives about how the world works. Breathitt County never fully recovered from the Morton years. The population that fled during 1936 to 1938 never returned. Whole sections of Jackson became ghost neighborhoods, houses standing empty for decades. The economy, already devastated by the Depression, took an additional blow from the mass exodus and the county's new reputation as a place of darkness and strange deaths. Sheriff William Haskins retired in 1940, broken by his failure to protect his community. He spent his remaining years. He died in 1950, 2 at age 70, 2 obsessively researching similar cases across the country, convinced that Morton was something ancient and predatory that moved through American history, collecting debts in currency that transcended money. His files, donated to the Kentucky Historical Society after his death, contain hundreds of pages documenting similar cases going back to colonial times. The families of the 17 victims dealt with their losses in different ways. Some left the county entirely, trying to escape the memory. Others stayed, living with the trauma, raising their children in the shadow of what had happened. Catherine Price's daughter Emily lived to age 73, dying in 2014, and she never stopped having nightmares about the 6 hours she couldn't remember, about the darkness Morton had shown her. The most disturbing legacy is this: the efficacy of Morton's method. He proved that in communities living on the edge of survival, fear can be weaponized to collect debts more effectively than any legal system. He demonstrated that people will destroy themselves financially, will sacrifice everything to avoid confronting terror. And he showed that some predators don't need weapons or physical violence. They need only the ability to make people believe that death is the alternative to payment. To this day, in certain parts of Breathitt County, older residents won't take out loans, won't borrow money under any circumstances. They remember the stories passed down from grandparents who lived through the Morton years. They remember that debts can be paid in ways that have nothing to do with currency, and occasionally, very occasionally, someone reports seeing a man in a dark suit walking the old roads at twilight, carrying a lantern and a black leather ledger. These sightings are dismissed as folklore, as urban legend, as the persistence of communal trauma in narrative form. But in 2019, a team of researchers from the University of Kentucky examined the confiscated ledger still held in state archives as evidence from the 1938 trial. They discovered something that previous investigators had missed. The handwriting in the ledger wasn't just similar across all entries. It was identical in ways that suggested either obsessive precision or the same hand writing across decades that should have aged, should have changed, should have shown variation. They also found entries in the ledger dating to before Morton's supposed arrival in Breathitt County in 1933. Entries from the early 1900s, from the 1800s, from dates that made no sense if Morton was a normal human being with a normal lifespan. The researchers published a paper titled Temporal Anomalies in the Morton Ledger, Evidence of Historical Record Keeping or Something Else. It was dismissed as academic overreach, as reading too much into an artifact, as the continuation of the mythology that had always surrounded the case. But the question remains, who or what was Cyrus Holt Morton? And more disturbingly, is he still out there under a different name in a different community, lending money at reasonable rates and collecting debts in the currency of absolute terror? The story of the debt collector who took lives instead of money remains one of the most disturbing cases in American criminal history, not because of what was proven, but because of what remains unknown. How did Morton kill his victims? Medical science had no explanation for how terror alone could stop a heart. Yet 17 people died with no physical cause beyond extreme fear. Dr. Whitfield theorized psychological manipulation so profound it triggered fatal cardiac events, but he couldn't explain the mechanism. Others suggested folk magic, supernatural ability, or some kind of toxin that left no trace. We may never know. Where did Morton come from? Despite extensive investigation, no record of his existence before 1933 was ever found. No family, no history, no origin story. It was as if he materialized fully formed, aged 42, with knowledge and abilities that suggested decades of practice at his particular form of predation. Is he still alive? The sightings continue. The similar cases appear in historical records across the country, spanning more than a century. If Morton was human, he would be well over 100 years old by now. Yet reports persist of a man matching his description, always in economically desperate communities, always offering loans at reasonable rates, always collecting debts with methods that leave no evidence but broken people and mysterious deaths. Perhaps these questions are meant to remain unanswered. Perhaps the not knowing is part of the horror, the recognition that some predators operate in the gaps of our understanding, in the spaces where law and reason and comfortable explanations fail. To this day, the black leather ledger sits in a climate-controlled archive in Frankfort, Kentucky, sealed in an evidence box that hasn't been opened since the 2019 research team finished their work. 17 names are marked in red ink with the word settled. Dozens more names remain, representing loans never repaid, debts that were abandoned when borrowers fled or died. According to archival records, Attempts have been made over the decades to destroy the ledger. In 1956, a fire in the evidence room consumed everything except the box containing Morton's belongings. In 1973, a flood damaged thousands of documents but left the ledger untouched. In 1998, a clerk attempted to feed the ledger into an industrial shredder as part of a records purge. The machine jammed, then caught fire, destroying itself but leaving the ledger intact. Some believe the ledger can't be destroyed because it's not just a record of debts. It's a contract written in something deeper than ink, binding borrowers to obligations that transcend mortality. That every name in that book represents not just a financial transaction, but a metaphysical one, a piece of soul exchanged for temporary relief from suffering. Others believe it's just a book, an artifact from a terrible time, a reminder of how poverty and desperation can make communities vulnerable to predators who understand that human fear is the most valuable currency of all. But on silent nights in the mountains of eastern Kentucky, when fog rolls through the valleys thick enough to touch, when shadows seem longer than the light that casts them, people still report hearing the sound of pages turning, the whisper of leather, bound covers opening and closing, the scratch of pen on paper recording debts, calculating interest, noting names of those who owe. Most dismiss it as wind, as imagination, as the echo of old traumas that refuse to fade, but some know better. The question we're left with isn't really about Cyrus Morton, it's about us, about the choices we make when confronted with impossible situations, about how desperation can make us vulnerable to predators, about the price we're willing to pay, literally and metaphorically, to survive another day, another season, another winter. The people of Breathitt County weren't fools, they weren't ignorant, they were desperate, and desperate people do desperate things. They borrow money they can't repay. They sign agreements they don't fully understand. They trade their future for their present because the future is theoretical, but hunger is immediate, cold is physical, and sickness is now. Morton, whatever he was, understood that. He built his entire operation on the foundation of human desperation. He didn't need to threaten people explicitly. He just needed to be the only one offering help, and to make the cost of that help so terrible that it became its own enforcement mechanism. We like to think we've evolved past such vulnerabilities, that modern financial systems, social safety nets, and legal protections keep us safe from predators like Morton. But have we really? Or have the predators just evolved too, wearing different faces, operating through different mechanisms, but still exploiting the same fundamental truth, that desperate people will agree to almost anything, and fear is the most effective collection agency ever devised. The story of the debt collector who took lives instead of money is a story about power, the power that comes from having what others need, and the terrible uses to which that power can be put. It's a story about community, about how quickly social bonds can fracture when survival becomes individual rather than collective. And it's a story about the limits of justice, about what happens when the law can't protect the innocent from evil that operates just outside the boundaries of what can be prosecuted. Most of all, it's a question: what would you do? If you were starving, if your children were sick, if winter was coming and you had no heat, no food, no options, would you borrow from someone like Morton? Would you sign your name in his ledger, agree to terms you didn't fully understand, hope that somehow you'd find a way to pay before the alternative collection became necessary? And if you couldn't pay, if the deadline came and went, and you stood before him with nothing to offer but excuses and apologies, would you run? Would you fight? Or would you, like most of the victims, simply accept what was coming, paralyzed by a fear so profound that it stopped your heart before any external force could. These aren't comfortable questions. They force us to confront uncomfortable truths about our own vulnerability, our own capacity for desperate choices, our own potential to become either victim or perpetrator when systems fail and darkness fills the gaps. If this journey through the fog-shrouded valleys of Breathitt County has resonated with you, if you find yourself lying awake tonight pondering the question of what you owe and what you're willing to pay, then this channel has more truths waiting in the shadows. Subscribe if you're willing to confront the uncomfortable questions about human nature that history tries to bury. Leave a like if this account provoked something deeper than entertainment, if it made you question the price of desperation and the value of a promise made under duress. And in the comments, I want to know, if you owed a debt you couldn't pay, and the creditor offered you an alternative that filled you with nameless dread, would you pay whatever cost necessary to avoid it? Would you fight? Or would you, like most humans throughout history, simply accept that some debts can never be truly settled, only transferred into currencies we pray we'll never have to understand? Until next time, remember the most terrifying stories are the ones that force us to see ourselves clearly, to see our own vulnerability, our own capacity for desperate bargains, our own willingness to trade the future for the present. And sometimes that recognition that we could be the next name in the ledger, marked in red ink as settled, is the darkness we're really afraid of. The most dangerous debts aren't the ones we owe to banks or lenders. They're the ones we owe to ourselves, to our choices, to the compromises we make in moments of desperation. Those debts, unlike Morton's, can never be settled with money. They can only be lived with, or paid for in ways that leave scars no one else can see.